I pulled into the parking lot of First Meridian Bank on a Tuesday morning, the same branch I'd used for 31 years, and I almost didn't notice it at first. You get a certain kind of tunnel vision when you're retired. The days blur together in a way nobody warned you about. I was there to update my signature card, something my son-in-law had been after me to do for weeks. Said the bank required it for the joint account he'd helped me set up after my wife passed. That's when I saw him, my son-in-law, standing inside the glass lobby with a woman I didn't recognize, both of them leaning over the customer service desk, talking low and fast the way people do when they don't want to be overheard. My daughter wasn't with him. She was supposed to be in Portland visiting her college roommate, a trip she'd been planning for 2 months. I sat in my car for a moment. Just sat there. His name is Warren. He's 41 years old, sells commercial real estate, drives a black Audi he can't really afford, and has been married to my daughter Joanna for 9 years. I have never fully trusted him. That's the honest truth, and I'm not ashamed to say it. There was always something slightly off about the way he spoke to me. Too smooth, too agreeable, like a man who'd learned that the fastest way to an old man's trust was to never disagree with him. I told myself I was being paranoid. Every father thinks the man who married his daughter isn't good enough. I told myself that every single time, so I watched him through the windshield. He passed a folder across the desk to the woman. She opened it, scanned it quickly, nodded. Warren signed something. She made copies. The whole thing took maybe 4 minutes, and then he shook her hand and walked out through the side exit without ever looking toward the parking lot. I didn't go into the bank that day. I drove home, put on a pot of coffee, and stared at my kitchen table for a long time. My name is Edward Callum. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a structural engineer with the same firm in Columbus, Ohio before I retired. I am not a dramatic man. I don't catastrophize. My wife Marion always said I was the most frustratingly even-tempered person she'd ever met, which she meant half as a compliment and half as a complaint. Marion passed away 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I'm still not fully over it, and I suspect I never will be. What I can tell you is that the months after she died were the hardest of my life, and I made some decisions during that time that I wouldn't have made if I'd been thinking clearly. One of those decisions was letting Warren help me with my finances. He'd offered, right after the funeral, said he knew a financial advisor, someone who could help me restructure things, make sure I was protected going forward. I was 66 years old, newly widowed, and drowning in paperwork I'd never had to deal with before, because Marion had always handled that side of things. Warren seemed to know exactly what to do. He was calm and organized and efficient, and I was grateful. I told myself I was grateful. He introduced me to a man named Victor Ashby, mid-50s, silver hair, an office downtown with a view of the river and diplomas on every wall. Victor was the kind of man who made you feel foolish for not having thought of something yourself. He restructured my investment accounts, consolidated 3 separate IRAs into one, and helped me set up what he called a streamlined estate plan that would, he assured me, simplify everything for my daughter when the time came. I signed a lot of documents in Victor's office. Too many, looking back. But I trusted him because Warren had brought me to him. And I trusted Warren because Joanna loved him. And I trusted Joanna because she was my daughter and the closest thing I had left to Marion. That's a long chain of trust to build on a man you've never been fully sure about. After I saw Warren at the bank, I started paying attention in a different way. The first thing I did was pull out my own copies of the documents I'd signed in Victor's office. I'd kept them in a manila folder in my desk drawer, which I realized now was not nearly careful enough. I spread them out on the kitchen table and read through them slowly, the way I used to read structural reports before I'd sign off on them. Methodically, looking for the thing that didn't add up. It took me 2 hours. There was a power of attorney document in the stack. I remembered signing it. Victor had explained it as a standard precaution, something that would allow a designated representative to act on my behalf if I became incapacitated. I'd assumed Joanna was the designated representative. It wasn't Joanna. The name on the document was Warren Douglas Holt. I set the paper down and went to the window and looked out the backyard, where Marion's rose bushes were just starting to come in. She'd planted them the first spring, after we moved into this house 28 years ago. I stood there for a very long time. Then I picked up the phone and called my nephew Curtis. Curtis is 39, works in corporate litigation in Cincinnati, and is the only lawyer I know personally. I'd watched him grow up. I'd helped pay for his last 2 years of law school when his father, my brother, got sick. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I'd found. I read him the relevant sections of the power of attorney document over the phone. There was a pause on his end that told me everything I needed to know before he said a single word. "Uncle Ed," he said finally, "don't touch anything else. Don't sign anything. Don't tell Warren you found this. I'm coming up this weekend." Curtis arrived Saturday morning with a colleague of his, a woman named Patrice who specialised in elder financial law. She was maybe 45, no nonsense, wore a blazer and brought her own notepad. The three of us sat at my kitchen table and went through every document I had, one by one. What they found over the next 3 hours made my stomach drop in stages, each discovery slightly worse than the last. The power of attorney was the beginning, but it wasn't even the most serious problem. Buried in the estate restructuring paperwork was a beneficiary amendment that had been added to my primary investment account, the one Victor had consolidated everything into. The amendment designated a holding company called Meridian Crest LLC as a secondary beneficiary, with a claim to 40% of the account's assets upon my death. I had never heard of Meridian Crest LLC. Patrice looked up the company. It had been registered in Delaware 14 months ago. 2 months after Marion died, by a registered agent whose address traced back to a commercial mail forwarding service. The LLC had 2 members listed on its formation documents. Victor Ashby was one of them. I already knew, before Patrice said the second name, what it was going to be. Warren Douglas Holt. I got up from the table and stood at the kitchen sink and ran cold water over my hands. I don't know why. It was the only thing I could think to do. Curtis came and stood next to me and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. When I sat back down, Patrice walked me through what she believed they'd done. Victor, using his position as my financial advisor, had restructured my accounts in a way that created a secondary beneficiary arrangement I hadn't understood. The power of attorney gave Warren the authority to make financial decisions on my behalf. Together, those 2 documents would have allowed Warren, after I died, or if I were deemed incapacitated, to direct a significant portion of my assets to a company he and Victor co-owned. My investment account held just over $800,000. Marion and I had saved it over 34 years of working. 40% of that was $320,000. "Is it legal?" I asked. "The documents are legal," Patrice said carefully. "Whether you were properly informed about what you were signing is a different question, and the undisclosed conflict of interest. Victor acting as your advisor while holding a financial stake in a beneficiary entity. That's a serious problem. That's the kind of thing that ends careers and triggers criminal investigations." "What do I do?" She leaned forward. "We report it to the Ohio Division of Securities. We file a complaint with the SEC. We contact Warren's broker-dealer if he holds any licenses, and Victor's compliance officer. And then," she paused, "we change the beneficiary designations immediately, today, before we do anything else. You still have authority over your own accounts. Use it." That afternoon, I drove to 3 different financial institutions and made changes. I revoked the power of attorney. I updated every beneficiary designation. I moved the consolidated account back to 2 separate institutions, splitting the assets the way they'd been before Victor had streamlined them. I did all of it without telling Warren, without telling Joanna, without telling anyone except Curtis and Patrice. I won't pretend that part was easy. Joanna called me that evening, just a regular check-in call, and I sat in my recliner and talked to her for 20 minutes about her Portland trip and the weather in Columbus, and whether I'd had the gutters cleaned yet. My voice didn't shake once. I surprised myself. She didn't know. I was almost certain of that. Whatever Warren had set up, he hadn't brought his own wife into it. Maybe he thought it was kinda that way. Maybe he just didn't want the complication of her knowing. Either way, her voice on the phone was the same as it had always been. Warm, a little hurried, asking if I was eating enough. I said I was eating fine. The harder question was what to do about Joanna. She was my daughter. She'd been married to this man for 9 years. They had a house together, a dog, and a life I was about to detonate with information she hadn't asked for and hadn't seen coming. I thought about Marion. I thought about what she would have done. Marion had a way of cutting through the sentimental fog of a situation and seeing the practical reality underneath. She would have said, "The truth is better than the alternative. It is always better, even when it doesn't feel that way." Especially then. So I waited until Curtis had filed the initial complaints. I waited until we had documentation of everything, a clear record of what had been done, who had done it, and when. And then, on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after I'd sat in that parking lot watching Warren through the windshield, I asked Joanna to come to my house for dinner. I cooked a real meal, pot roast, the way Marion used to make it, with the carrots and potatoes in the same pan. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving. I let us sit and eat and talk for almost an hour before I said anything. And then I told her everything. She didn't say a word for a very long time. She sat across the table from me with her wine glass in her hand, and she just looked at me, and I watched the colour drain slowly out of her face. "Show me the documents," she said finally. I had copies ready. She read through them at my kitchen table, slowly, the way I had. When she got to the LLC formation with Warren's name on it, she set the papers down and pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at them. "How long have you known?" she asked. 3 weeks. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I needed to make sure you were protected first," I said. "And I needed to make sure I had everything documented before anyone knew I knew." She looked up at me. Her eyes were dry, but barely. "He told me Victor was the best in Columbus. He said you needed someone to handle this because you weren't." She stopped. "Because I wasn't capable of handling it myself." She didn't answer, which was an answer. "Joanna," I said carefully, "did Warren ever use the word incapacitated around you? Or suggest that I was struggling more than I was?" She set down her wine glass. "He said you'd seemed confused at the bank, that you'd had trouble understanding some of the paperwork." "I signed everything I was given," I said. "That's not confusion, that's trust." She wiped her eyes. We sat in the kitchen where she'd grown up, where her mother had cooked dinner every night for 28 years. And she cried in a way that made her look about 12 years old. I got up and sat next to her, and put my arm around her shoulders, and we stayed like that for a while. When she pulled herself together, she asked me what she should do. "That's not my decision," I said. "This is your marriage. But I'll tell you what I've done, and I'll tell you what Curtis and Patrice think is going to happen." What happened over the following months moved faster than I expected. The Ohio Division of Securities opened a formal investigation into Victor Ashby within 6 weeks of our complaint. Victor held a Series 65 license, which meant he was operating as a registered investment advisor, someone with a legal fiduciary duty to act in his client's best interests. The undisclosed interest in Meridian Crest LLC was a clear violation of that duty. The investigation expanded when regulators found that I was not the only client whose estate documents had been structured to benefit the LLC. There were 4 others, all of them widows or widowers, all of them over 65, all of them recently bereaved. Victor Ashby surrendered his investment advisor license in month 3 of the investigation. In month 7, he was indicted on 3 counts of securities fraud and 2 counts of breach of fiduciary duty. His assets were frozen pending restitution proceedings. Whatever Warren had imagined his cut of Meridian Crest LLC would eventually be worth, the company was now the subject of federal and state inquiries and worth nothing. Warren's situation was more complicated because he wasn't a licensed professional. He was a private individual who had co-founded an LLC. The question was whether his actions rose to the level of criminal conspiracy. Curtis said it depended on how much the prosecutors could prove he knew and intended. The civil exposure, though, was significant. Patrice filed suit against Warren personally on my behalf for breach of fiduciary duty as my designated power of attorney holder. That lawsuit settled out of court 8 months after it was filed. The terms are confidential, but I'll say this: I was made whole. Every dollar I might have lost was accounted for, and then some. Warren and Joanna separated in the 4th month of the investigation. The divorce was finalized 11 months later. Joanna moved back to Columbus. She found a small house in the neighborhood where she grew up, about 4 miles from mine, and I help her with things when she needs it, and she checks on me more often than she used to. It's not the life she planned. I know that. I watch her sometimes when she doesn't know I'm watching, and I can see her recalibrating, adding up what she thought her life was going to look like and subtracting what it's become and trying to figure out what comes next. She's 40 years old. There's a lot of next ahead of her. Marion would have known exactly what to say to her. I do the best I can. What I know, and what I tell Joanna when she lets me, is that the truth is only terrible on the day you find it out. After that, it just becomes the truth. You build around it. You adjust your footing and you keep walking. Because what's the alternative? I've been a structural engineer for 34 years. I know what a compromised foundation looks like. I know what happens if you ignore it and pretend it isn't there. The building stands for a while. Sometimes it stands for a long time. But it always comes down eventually, and when it does, it takes everything else with it. Warren thought I was old enough to be managed. He thought grief had made me slow, that the paperwork would confuse me, that I was close enough to the end that it almost didn't count as stealing. He was wrong about all of it. I'm 67 years old. I have more money in my accounts today than the day I retired. I have my daughter back, and my nephew, and Marion's rose bushes blooming in the backyard. Victor Ashby goes to trial in the fall. I've already spoken to the prosecutor's office. I'll testify if they need me to. I'll tell them what I told you. All of it. Every detail. Because the thing they don't teach you when you're young is that experience isn't something that leaves you as you get older. It accumulates, it sharpens, and there comes a moment when the men who underestimated you realize, far too late, that they made a very expensive mistake. Age is not weakness. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.